Hi. So today I'm going to talk about pragmatism and phenomenology as two major schools of thought. One is propagated by William James, other by Husserl. Obviously, the other players, but these are the two main ones we're going to talk about today. So, starting with William James had this idea of consciousness, wherein he defined consciousness as feeling. Now, what is feeling? Feeling is essentially, say, you have an event, say, you see a snake, then you have an emotion, say, you're afraid, and then therefore you have a body change, therefore you run. This is what was the school of thought before William James, but he propagated it as an event happening, the snake seeing, a body change, you're running away, and that running away would be the cause of your feeling, which would be feeling afraid. He essentially said that feeling is this feeling or this consciousness is all pervasive in the sense it it for that moment that you're afraid, it exists throughout eternity, and that feeling is it exists for a very small amount of time. That's how he defined consciousness, as this broken sort of a stream of feelings. There is This is pretty interesting because he essentially takes feeling or consciousness out of context, in that he says that the context in which it happens does not matter, and it is these feelings or these consciousness exist outside, or this feeling of being afraid or the fear exists outside of the human as such. uh, he also in this is pretty similar to Descartes' idea, or this of consciousness, or what Hume calls idea as such. Um, he makes a major distinction between looking within to observe internal phenomenon, which is what Hume and Locke talked about earlier as introspection or such, versus introspecting to understand concepts and their relations, which is closer to Plato's idea of math or the absolute truth as such. But in regard to truth and reality, he essentially says that truth exists only for reality, in that the perceiver's truth is the perceiver's reality. This is sort of like Hume's idea of causation and how he explains causation, but it is uh, it is significant because it explains truth as an attribute of all of our beliefs. Another interesting idea in this is that of verifiability of truth, in that every truth or every experience that we think to be true is should be verifiable, and then only can it become the reality itself, which sort of ties into Gödel's incompleteness theorem, because and subsequently Russell's paradox, because it Russell's Gödel's incompleteness theorem essentially says that not everything can be provable within a paradigm, and you have to go outside that truth to verify that, which essentially means that there can be never all truths, which is contradicting the William James idea of feeling and how consciousness exists, which should not be dependent on this. Then comes his idea of God, where he sort of is indifferent to the existence of God. He says there should be no dogma in relation to God. He says that God is probably a product of that feeling, and that uh, there is a the Nietzsche's God that is dead does not really matter, because God is is individual to the person as such. So it does not matter whether if a person believes in it, it's fine, and he or she should believe and continue believing in it, and if it works, it works. But like, there should be no dogma to the existence of God as such. This also brings me to Freud, who's another pragmatist. He basically talks about consciousness as there being a subconscious, which is what drives the consciousness. So he divides it into id, ego, and superego. Ego is the rational part. Id is the irrational part, and superego is essentially the combining factor between the two. So mostly we think from our ego and we do stuff from our ego, but sometimes our id comes out and it acts irrationally, or acts as for our repressed desires, and the superego sort of controls the ego and balances the two. This Both of these schools of thought are major blows on experimental psychology, because both of them are sort of based on introspection and thinking from within. Now, now this brings me to phenomenology, because when William James talked about truth was reality, he basically says that they are essentially individual to the person, whereas phenomenology says that there's a major, or Husserl primarily says that there's a major difference between a being and a phenomenon, in that the being has intentionality. So the phenomenon is the actual truth or the reality, and the being and this perception of that phenomenon is uh, the person's reality, with Williams explains, but like it's not the truth as such. And he calls the entire process of reducing or that perception to the actual truth as phenomenological reduction. He talks about imminent there being an imminent perception versus transcendent perception, which is imminent perception is the one you see, and transcendent perception is the one you see from outside. Now, how does this outside come from? It's based on essentially consciousness. So he talks about this idea of there being a transcendental consciousness, where every person can sort of view themselves from outside and see what they have seen is whether actually it's right, or whether it's actually the truth, or whether it's their perception of the truth, and therefore distinguish between the two. He therefore does reinvent, as a result, Descartes' view of the self, because that is also based on that perception of oneself, which Descartes didn't really talk about the transcendental consciousness. So it's probably a byproduct of what he sees himself as, and therefore is sort of maligned. Then the important concept of intentionality is obviously differentiating a being from a phenomenon, which is sort of contradicting Schopenhauer's idea of the will, because each being is defined by having intentionality and not degrees of intentionality. So, therefore, Schopenhauer's idea of the will is sort of contradicted here. Then another major idea over here is epochs, or the suspension of judgment, which is in relation to the perception, the thing that you see. So when you observe something, you make ideas about what it could be, or these concepts, and therefore the suspension of judgment is essentially when you're viewing, you view it objectively and differentiate between what it is that is your perception and what is the actual truth or reality. Therefore, Husserl's idea of reality or truth in itself, or consciousness for the matter, as being something that can help you decide between truth and reality, is majorly different from the pragmatist view, which is that truth and reality are dependent on the perceiver itself. Thank you.